Okay, in the last chapter, we talked about how slavery was starting to spread and it was going to basically start to divide the country and it's going to lead up to the Civil War. So, Nebraska and Kansas both wanted to join the United States and join the country and become states. Nebraska is cold, doesn't have great weather, so Nebraska is most likely going to be a free state. Kansas, on the other hand, has warm weather and it's farther down south, and it's much more likely that Kansas will become a slave state. So, the pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters both want to get into Kansas and claim land for themselves before Kansas becomes a state. They want to be there and be able to vote on what kind of state Kansas is going to be. And it starts to get pretty heated. There's a group of people called the New England Immigrant Aid Society, and they show up to Kansas with these boxes full of Bibles, but the Bibles aren't really Bibles, it's actually ammunition and guns. So they're getting ready because they know this argument over slavery could turn into something much more heated. But Kansas is eventually going to get the nickname Bleeding Kansas because there's going to be lots of conflict here. So when it came time to vote and decide what Kansas would be under popular sovereignty, whether it's going to be free or slave state, a guy named David Atkinson gets a bunch of people who support slavery to move into Kansas right before the election. So right before the election, get a bunch of supporters of slavery, they all show up and they vote, and what happens is Kansas becomes a slave state. They're the ones who have the most votes. But the people who were against slavery felt like they were cheated, and they formed their own government. So basically Kansas is split into two right now. There's two separate groups saying they're in charge. One supports slavery, one wants to get rid of slavery. Each group of people was becoming more and more upset and more violent about it. And what happened is there would be violence from one side, from the side that wanted to keep slaves against the side that wanted to get rid of slavery. And every time there'd be one violent outbreak, it would escalate and more people and more property would get damaged. It eventually gets up to 200 deaths and over $2 million in property damage. And at this point, people are starting to realize that the chance of this issue being solved peacefully is pretty slim. So what happens next? There's an unusual event in May of 1856. A guy named Charles Sumner, he's a senator, and he gives a speech in the United States Senate, and in his speech, he's insulting slavery, but he's also insulting a guy named Andrew Butler from South Carolina. He's belittling him, he's making fun of him. I believe Andrew Butler just had a stroke. So he's making these personal attacks on him, making fun of him, accusing the South of being ignorant for supporting slavery. And what happens is people start hyping it up and they start cheering for him as he's talking trash on people in the South. But a guy named Preston Brooks, he's a member of the House of Representatives. He is nephew to the man that Charles Sumner was talking trash on. So what happens? Charles Sumner is getting ready to give another speech, and people think that he's going to start, blowing down. He's going to start talking trash again, and they're hyping him up. And once he gets up and starts talking, Preston Brooks, the nephew, walks up, grabs a cane, and smacks him in the head almost 30 times. He ends up hitting Charles Sumner and causing brain damage, and Charles Sumner actually is blind for quite a while after this. So these are people who were elected officials, people who we voted into office to make decisions, and they are resorting to violence. So the next election is coming up, and slavery is the main issue. The Democrats choose a guy named James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. They think he's a safe choice because he's not super offensive. He's not for slavery. He's not against it. He's just kind of middle of the road guy. So they think he'll be a safe choice. The Republicans chose John C. Fremont of California. He was a war hero during the Mexican War and kind of known for his exploring. During the past couple decades, more and more immigrants have come to America too. And what happened is there's a group of people called the American Party or the Know Nothing Party. And they are afraid that immigrants are taking over the country, and they want to slow the amount of immigrants coming in, and they choose a guy named Millard Fillmore to run for president. He was previously a vice president and then a president. So James Buchanan wins the election. Even though the Republicans lost, they did better than they expected. and they were optimistic about the Republican Party in the future. They didn't get the victory, but they were close. So President Buchanan is hoping that the slavery problem is just going to solve itself. And I don't know if you guys know anything about ignoring a problem, but if you ignore a problem, it tends to get worse and worse. So he chose to ignore this problem, and 2 days after he took office, the Supreme Court made a decision that's going to make things even worse. It is about a man named Dred Scott and his court case. So Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri. His master took him to live in the free state of Illinois and then to Wisconsin, which was a free territory. Then he returned home to Missouri and he died. So Dred Scott says, I lived in 2 free areas. I should be free once my master dies. And he goes to court to sue for his freedom. And that court case gets all the way up to the highest court in the country, the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court makes the decision. They decide, since Dred Scott was a slave, he was not a citizen and he had no right to sue for his freedom. So they're basically saying, even if he is right, it doesn't matter because he's not a citizen. The other thing they decided was that the Missouri Compromise was illegal. So that map I showed you in the last chapter that split the country into 2 pieces, they said that map's gone. And they said that since slaves were property, you could take your slaves wherever you want. And people in the North, they are furious about this. They did not want slavery to spread. And because the Supreme Court made this decision, slavery can spread now. Okay, so let's finish this up. In 1854, there was a guy named Abraham Lincoln, and he gave a speech saying the Kansas-Nebraska Act was unfair. And he says we need to end slavery. And initially, Abe Lincoln doesn't want to get rid of slavery completely. He just wants to start getting rid of it slowly. Abraham Lincoln is running against a guy named Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was thought to be unbeatable in an argument. He was famous for his ability to always win arguments. And Abraham Lincoln was kind of famous for being a failure. He tried to be a lawyer and he wasn't great at it. He tried to get elected to the House of Representatives and he struggled and he didn't get reelected. But Abraham Lincoln challenges Stephen Douglas to 7 debates. So Stephen Douglas, he accepts these debates because he knows that he is excellent in arguing, and Abraham Lincoln, he thinks, is kind of a chump. So he welcomes the opportunity to debate Abraham Lincoln because he's such a good speaker, he thinks there's no way Lincoln can hang with him. During the debates, Lincoln does something a little bit tricky, though. So he brings up the issue of popular sovereignty, and that's what Stephen Douglas suggested, that the states can decide for themselves if they want slavery or not. And Abraham Lincoln says, if you want the states to be able to vote if they want slavery or not, they can vote to keep slavery, but they can also vote to forbid it, which means they can outlaw it. And Stephen Douglas had not thought about that. So he basically tricked Stephen Douglas into admitting that the people could vote to outlaw slavery, even if there was not a law to officially do it. And Abraham Lincoln got kind of a reputation from this debate because Abraham Lincoln would not always say what you wanted to hear, but he became famous for always saying the truth, and he got the nickname Honest Abe. Okay, so John Brown was a guy who was in a lesson or 2 ago. He's an abolitionist, and he wants to end slavery. And he's not so much about doing it peacefully. He says that time has passed. He's ready to solve things with whatever methods are necessary. So John Brown wants to free the slaves. He plans to take his sons and go attack a military base in the South to steal the weapons and give them to the slaves so the slaves can fight back and get their freedom. So he goes to this place, Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with his 5 sons, and they basically go into this military base and they raid it. And the military base is not very well guarded. They only have 1 or 2 guards stationed, so him and his 5 sons go in there pretty easily and take it over. What happens, though, is the slave reinforcements who he's expecting to show up and take the weapons and fight alongside him, they never show up. So eventually Robert E. Lee brings in the Marines and they capture John Brown. John Brown's sons are killed, And John Brown is charged with treason, which means betraying your country. And he is eventually executed as well. And John Brown, before he's executed, writes that he is now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. So what he is saying is he does not see a way that this issue of slavery will ever be resolved peacefully. Okay, guys, so we just did a whole chapter in one day, so I need you to open up the worksheet for chapter 15, lesson 1, 2, 3, and get started.